Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special episode of the Speaker Series from the Global National Security Institute, GNSI. I'm Dave Oakley, Academic Director at GNSI. And I'm very excited to welcome our special guest today, Dr. Dave Gioe. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you.
He's currently an associate professor at the West Point Cyber Institute and the Director of Studies for the Cambridge Security Initiative and convener of its International Security and Intelligence Program. You have a very unique, fascinating background as both a scholar and a practitioner. I was hoping you could tell our listeners a little bit about how you got to the position you're currently in and some of your experience that brought you there.
Sure, happy to. I should say that as a current government employee, this is only the world according to Dave Gioe, and does not represent any official government position or anything like that. That being said, sure, I started my career as an intelligence officer, as a presidential management fellow in the FBI, working counterterrorism and counterintelligence. Started in 2001, so obviously a very 9/11 and a very trying but exciting time for our country. I then switched over to CIA and did analytical and operational roles at CIA around the world until the end of 2011, and then decided I wanted to go back to school and went and got a PhD and wanted to. Was planning to go back to CIA, and it was a great career, and I loved it. Um, but after teaching and speaking and writing, and I just thought it was exciting. So I wanted a teaching job, and so I ended up at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And I think I should say, sort of parenthetically about the agency. I think, as much as I tried to do there for the good of our country and that of our allies, I think I can probably do more good on the outside as a historian, as a scholar, as a speaker, just demystifying intelligence, explaining why it's good, why we need it, how it helps us navigate a complex world in statecraft and world order. It gives us decision advantage, military advantage. And so, me not going back to CIA, I think actually gives me the opportunity to do things like this right now, to interact with students, audiences around the world, and again, to share thoughts on the importance of intelligence through my writing. Um, anyway, so I taught it at West Point, intermitted a little bit for Navy mobilization, but overall, I've been at West Point now for 10 years. I don't know where that time has gone, but it goes, as you know. And then I just wanted to kind of do something a little bit different, maybe get back to the UK. And so I'm a British Academy Global Professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, which is a four-year fellowship hosted by King's. And it's wonderful to have a foot in U.S. academia, but also to have a foot in British academia as well.
Going back to your practitioner career, you really entered at a very interesting time. I mean, the immediate post 9/11 world, where we really kind of saw a change in intelligence, and then 20 years of war and stuff. And so, looking at that as a practitioner, and then studying it as an intelligence scholar, and reflecting on both your experiences studying it, I guess, and then also living it. Um, what do you think about the transition of intelligence during the GWAT and then today with strategic competition?
Sure. So I was actually, people talk about the post 9/11 generation, but actually I started my career as an intern in the Naval Criminal Investigative Service in the year 2000. And so, there was a pre 9/11, and I remember that as well. And I remember actually being on duty at NCIS the morning, so, on the Washington Navy Yard on the morning of October the 12th, 2000, when a call came in from the port of Yemen that said, hey, the USS Cole has been attacked. And it's hard to imagine now, but in the pre 9/11 world, well, what was that? What happened? Was that an accident? Was that we went to Jane's, the military compendium, because we didn't know what rips a hole in the side of a destroyer at the waterline. The last thing on our minds was, terrorists in a small boat, right? In a rib, a rigid hull inflatable boat. And so we started going through limpet mines, like looking and seeing, what's the thing that could have done this, because we talk about I don't love these terms, failure of imagination or that sort of thing, at 9/11. But actually, we weren't quite really understanding the threat of suicide terrorism, even as early as the USS Cole, because that wasn't really our first thought. As you say, of course, people got. I started, at the FBI doing counterintelligence work, and particularly counter economic espionage work, and a lot of those accounts just went, uncovered as people got transferred to counterterrorism, as I did as well. Um, how should we focus in on the future? Is that where we're going now? Like, what did you want?
Well, I guess 2 parts to that. So, you're describing a part of, the beginning of the global war on terrorism, right? And really, you look at the time, there had been about a decade to where there had been reductions in expenditures on intelligence and stuff. You had this, the peace dividend,
Mhm.
the 10 years after the end of the Cold War. Then all of a sudden, we're pushed into counterterrorism. That counterterrorism leads to Afghanistan invasion of Iraq. Seems to me it shaped a whole generation of intelligence officers. You and I both came into intelligence at that time.
Mm,
And I just, you comment on how that experience shaped our generation, I guess, or
mm.
intelligence officers since 2001. And if you think that, the future of intelligence will be different. The type of intelligence officer we need, what's going to be expected, is going to be different.
Yeah, I think, so Fred Hitz, who was the agency's inspector general, and he wrote an article in World Politics Review in about 2011-ish, give or take. And he basically argued that, the agency had become predator centric and, sort of overly militarized. And I think we did see that, right? Because, fighting the GWAT, as it were, from an intelligence perspective, that goes against, kind of the tradecraft that we were taught to do, right? You never go straight to your meeting site. Well, you do in the GWAT, right? You don't, you're not armed most of the time. Well, you are in the GWAT, right? You never have a phone on you, right? You are in the GWAT. You generally operate as a single case officer, not, going out with security or something, well, you are in the GWAT. And so, all of these things, I think, every meeting seems to be an emergency meeting, right? In the GWAT, right? There's no such thing as a sort of, a routine agent meeting. And so, yeah, I think it's fair enough that, the agency, we kind of didn't know where Joint Special Operations Command ended and CIA began, and of course we saw, the merger of those things to actually to really good effect, in the Bin Laden raid on May 2nd, 2011. So I think it's hard not to agree with Fred Hitz, that the agency did become sort of a paramilitary-ish organization, and I think it kind of had that feel. At the same time, however, there was an urgent need to get into Afghanistan, right? To defeat the Taliban, to deny Afghanistan as a safe haven to Al Qaeda, and so it's one of those scenarios where I think, you know, was it good for the agency? Probably not. But was it what was needed at the time? Probably so. And so I think, to the agency's great credit, it adapted relatively well. We used to say, we had all these, little sayings, right? It's like trying to, build the airplane in flight or trying to, change a tire on a car going 60 miles an hour. And people forget that, there was the 9/11 Commission, which published a report which said, "Hey, you guys have to, you missed this, and that's true. And so you have to redo, right? That the answer is essentially structural, right? That you have to restructure the intelligence community, right? You're going to have a Department of Homeland Security, you're going to have a Director of National Intelligence, and so you're both restructuring. If the idea, just to go back for a second, if the idea is that uh, the Al Qaeda operatives operated in the seams between the domestic and the foreign, right? And we create we do create seams intentionally, right? To protect civil liberties, and that's true. And so they slipped into those seams. And so we just sort of ripped the garment apart and had a bazillion new seams, as we were then re-sewing it up in the DNI model. That very little got dropped, and there wasn't another 9/11. I think was to the agency's credit, or I mean, really to the community's credit. It wasn't just the agency. We're up to what, 17 members of the intelligence community, and it's to their great credit, working as a team, that nothing got dropped. But what Fred Hitz said after his sort of critique that the CIA, and I guess maybe he meant the community to some broader extent, was overly militarized, was that he said, "Look, we've got to get back to sort of the traditional status quo." And he listed out a bunch of things, that were what, 12 years ago or 13 years ago, that now seem eerily prescient. He wanted to know. He said, "Look, we have to get back to pre-GWAT, sort of business matters, and not just processes. The topics." And so he listed out, the future of European unity, right, and European security. Well, that certainly was a big thing. The financial crisis across Europe. He wanted to know about the euro. He talked about issues with Russia. Obviously, we see where that's where that's come. He talked about China and Iran and North Korea. And some of the challenges that always take up sort of the top billing in the worldwide threat assessment. The only thing he didn't talk about, actually, I think, was cyber operations and influence, and sort of the IW campaigns that were sort of the disinformation campaigns that we're struggling with now. But I think he was right that at some point, the GWAT sort of needed to kind of come to a close, and look, there's always going to be a need, for the counterterrorism professional, and there's always going to be a need for the special operator at the pointy end of the spear. We see that in off the coast of Somalia, off the coast of Yemen, inside Yemen. We see that in Syria and in Iraq, and we see that all over. And I think there's just sort of a steady drumbeat, if you like, that's never going to go away. But as we've returned to sort of a great power competition, Russia and China model, and I think frankly we're overdue. Because we sort of said, hey, we don't want to play the GWAT game anymore. Now we want to play the great power game. And Russia and China were like, well, that's great. We've been playing without you for many years, but welcome back to the game. So I think it's tremendously important that the U.S. intelligence community, gets sort of over the adrenaline of the GWAT, and sort of returns to the status quo. But I think that sounds bad, but with status quo, I think what Fred Hitz means is the pre-war order of things that keep us up at night.
Yeah, I don't know if this makes sense. I always thought about it, although it's both intelligence, and intelligence is needed for both. To me, there's always seemed to be a difference between the collection of intelligence, the analysis to understand the world broadly, understand intentions and stuff like that, and then the use of intelligence, collection of intelligence to enable operations.
Mm.
It seems to me that there's, while there might be some overlap, it's distinct. And if you build up a community that's focused on that enabling operations, sometimes that broader understanding of the world is lost. And you mentioned during a great talk this afternoon, the tradecraft effect of some of that. Going into a war zone, and the tradecraft in a war zone is compared to what I would probably think of more of a traditional station
Mm.
overseas.
Yeah, I wanted to say something though. I think about about one of the earlier part of your question, about sense making, because I think we get the sense, that sense making of the world. I mean, because you get the sense that intelligence must mean prognostication, right? And the analyst has their crystal ball, and Intel is asked what's going to happen next, and that's just not the way it is. You know, they're analysts, giving their best judgment based on the best information available. And the hard part, I used to have a boss who used to say, I didn't lie to you, Dave. The truth changed, and the truth changes. I mean that's a factual statement. And so and so uh, I think that we need to do a better job sort of explaining, to policymakers, to decision makers, and to the American people, look, intelligence is decision advantage, right? Is sense making in a complex world, and I think actually we did ourselves, we in the intelligence business did ourselves a real disservice. And if you'll permit me a slight tangent, in the 1990s, when like CNN or cable news was kind of coming on board all the time, we decided that we were going to be, classified CNN, right? And we were going to be the people that were scooping CNN because CNN was scooping intelligence. And so we said, we're going to play your game. And so we tried to keep up, in intelligence with products, that were sort of keeping up with the 24-hour news cycle. And you can't do that, right? We played their game, and what we taught policymakers was, oh, if you want the classified version of that CNN story, oh well, here it is, we have it. And I think that came at expense, as you're sort of talking about, of long range analytical forecasting, and so things got more tactical, as you suggested. I think that's right, but I think they got more tactical because, well, of two things. Number one, of the CNN effect, and trying to, be Johnny on the spot when policymaker A sees a story, on 24-hour TV or cable and says, "Oh, okay, well, what does the IC have on that?" Right? And so you have to kind of feed that beast. There's an expectation that there's the classified version, of every story. I also think, however, that for most of the GWAT, there were troops in contact, and so, if you make, I think any intelligence manager choose between, supporting the military and, young people in harm's way versus, what's the, I don't know, North Korean tomato crop going to be in 5 years based on water table estimates, that may be important, for the future of the North Korean regime and stability and people starving and whatever. Um, but yeah, when there's young people, in war zones, the balance just shifts in that direction. Now that we're out of Afghanistan and we're out of Iraq, and hopefully we can, sort of get back to a better balance. But and I think we were also talking about the tradecraft, earlier. For analysts, right? The analytical tradecraft matters. How do you write for a consumer that's not, current intel all the time, right? How do you research and prepare and brief, sort of more long range, estimative intelligence. And then for the case officer, uh, you know, you have to operate as normal, right? And that sort of tradecraft hasn't really changed that much, from the Moscow of the 1960s. I mean, those rules. We often think that technology changes everything, and it does. But actually, um, there's a strong sense that you might need to kind of go back a couple to not use a smartphone, to use a dumb phone. um, I'm told that the Russians now like typewriters, right? In Russian intelligence headquarters, because look, hard to hack a typewriter. It's been done before in a great project that I won't bore you with, but your listeners should go check out. I think it's called the Gunman Project, about the Soviets doing a supply chain operation against American, I think, electronic typewriters. So I'll leave that there for your listeners. But turns out even typewriters are not invulnerable. But the point is that, going back to sort of the old ways of doing things, the low tech ways of doing things, that might be making a comeback.
You said the CNN effect, and kind of want to follow up to modern times, and it seems to me that where as you described the race to beat CNN to the punchline to the story, the classified version, or provide the classified version. Could be something similar what we're seeing now with artificial intelligence, what a lot of people call, open source intelligence, where you
Mm,
have individuals who, and Ukraine's a great example. You see these open source intelligence practitioners. Some people have referred to them as, who are doing dives into data and able to like track Russian troop movements and identify stuff like that. Do you think there's the same kind of risk as the desire to beat those individuals to the punchline that might take the intelligence community in a direction they don't want to go?
Yeah, I think it could. Let me say something about AI in the which you led off with, because I think that's a shorter question or shorter answer than the uh, than uh, than OSINT. Um, I think there's a concern, about well, will AI replace intelligence analysts? I mean, if you were to feed a large language model with all the classified things that we know, and just have a policymaker, type it in, well, why do you need the intelligence community anymore? I think one of the easiest answers to that question is that if you've ever been briefing a policymaker, they're not often not intelligence experts. And so you're sort of teaching the subject, but you're also kind of teaching about intelligence, right? What can it do for you and what can't it do for you? What are its limits? What can you task it to do? And with AI, when I've started playing around with AI now, and I even pay the money for the good version. And I was late to the party, but I'm learning. And I think one of the fun things about AI is that you can get a lot of information from it, but it doesn't tell you if you've asked a good question. It tries to answer your question, and I think an average analyst will answer the question asked, but a really good analyst will engage with the policymaker and ask a series of questions of the policymaker to try to refine what does the policymaker really need to know? Like, what are you really asking me here? Does that make sense?
More of a conversation.
It's a conversation where you're sort of teaching the policymaker what the right question. If you want to get this answer, right, here are the questions that you need to be asking, and here's how we can task the system, right, to generate requirements to get something to collect for the analysts to assess and brief you on. And that's, AI can't really have a useful conversation and help you think through your questions. On OSINT, I think there's a grave misunderstanding about what OSINT means. Because when you say, oh, well, who's the king of OSINT? It's Bellingcat. Well, yeah, I mean, they're amazing. But it's not OSINT, right? When you think of OSINT, you think of things that, Dave Oakley or Dave Gioe can Google up, right? And OSINT is like advanced Googling. And now there's all these methodologies, sort of for structured OSINT and stuff. But Bellingcat, uh, what they do is mega impressive, and I'm not trying to take anything away from it. But you don't have access to that stuff, and I don't have access to that stuff. Bellingcat, buys gray data on the black market. Bellingcat, works on the dark web and makes bulk data purchases from corrupt Russian officials at the Moscow DMV, and that's how they figure out that GRU cars are registered to XYZ officers because they don't get speeding tickets if the car is registered to their work. And so their model is not advanced Googling, right? Their model is working sort of in this gray, I bought this data off the dark web kind of stuff. To your broader question about how OSINT sort of challenges the community, I welcome OSINT. I think there is a classification bias, as we were talking about earlier, where if something says secret or top secret, then it's either more credible or more interesting or juicier, or a policymaker will lend it more credence because we had to collect it, we had to steal it or collect it, through some tech exploit or something. So there's a classification bias where, I've been really impressed with what non-Bellingcat OSINTers can do. And as you say, Ukraine is one of the most amazing examples. One of my favorite examples in Ukraine was on February 5th, there was a Russian guy who was taking his dog for a walk in southern Russia somewhere, and I don't know, it's 5:30 in the morning, and he takes a TikTok video of a missile heading south. You can tell that by the where the sun is and in the morning and whatever. So we know it's this missile heading south, i.e., towards Ukraine. But what is it? He doesn't know. He's just random Russian dude who's like, I don't see these things driving through my village every day on my dog walk. He thought it was novel. He made a TikTok video. Well, a guy from the Rand Corporation in the States um, saw that video and identified, hey, that's an Iskander missile. These are its capabilities. This is how it fits into Russian doctrine, and it's on its way to Ukraine. Right? And there's millions of these examples of people just sort of, um, putting things on the internet. Right? They're sort of like a sonobui, right? Like they don't really know what they're collecting. They're just passing information up to social media or wherever, and then anyone can act on it. You can be an OSINTer and try to make sense of it, or you can be the Ukrainians. One of the questions that's not been asked properly of the lawyers, I think, is, well, who is a combatant, right? So if you or I are Ukrainians and we see something in our village and we call Ukrainian special forces or Ukrainian intelligence and we're like, hey, this is what's going on in my village, we are, I think, combatants, right? According to, international the law of armed conflict. But what if we just post a TikTok video, right? My intent is not for it to get to the Ukrainians or anyone else, right? I'm just posting it to, the web for likes, um, and then sure enough, the Ukrainians can and have done, right, taken kinetic strikes based on social media stuff. So I think that's a really interesting sort of, tech tech is playing a role, and we've not quite figured out the norms about it. The final thing I wanted to say about tech was that, when you were talking about, how does the community feel about it? One of the reasons why I like it was, so the British, as you may know, the British Ministry of Defense puts out these tweets every day about, their assessment of what's going on in Ukraine. And is it sexy secret intelligence? No, it's just their assessment. There's 3 bullet points of what they think is going on a certain topic. But I like that the intelligence community is sort of speaking to people. I think intelligence needs to show a little leg because the days of no comment, or the maverick, well, I tell you but I have to kill you, or that kind of thing, people don't put up with that stuff anymore. And I think, as I said, demystifying intelligence, this is what we do, I think, is important. I also think it's important that you don't, Ukraine is a good example. You don't have to trust what the IC says about Ukraine, or about what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. The Russians are indiscriminately killing people, or the Russians are targeting, heating infrastructure or whatever. There's plenty of OSINTers now who are documenting all this stuff. You don't have to take the IC's word for, how well the Russians are doing or how well the Ukrainians are doing. OSINT carries a lot of that water, and so, you can sort of almost double check that what the IC is saying seems to be borne out in reality, right? So having a reporting track record over time that the IC is calling it as they see it, right? They're earning a reputation for truthfulness, I think, is really important.
I mean, in my mind, I distinguish. I never question the value of open source research, open source information, and I kind of find the debate. And it's back to your comment about for too long we valued something based on its classification level, right? Um, but I still distinguish in my mind the difference between open source research that should inform intelligence analysis and this thing called OSINT, right?
Mm.
And I think that when we use the term so broadly to talk about what a government practitioner does in open source research to enable, and then also as a label to describe non-government folks, the lines start to get blurred and confused about what is an intelligence professional.
Yeah, so there's a Dr. Joe Hatfield, it teaches at Annapolis, and he published an article maybe almost a year ago now, in the Journal of, I think, Intelligence and Counterintelligence, uh, called "There's No Such Thing as OSINT," and it was a provocative argument, and I'll probably screw up Joe's argument, but basically he says that OSINT is the conceptual junk drawer because, if it's not humant, or if it's not imint, or if it's not SIGINT, and we don't know what else to call it, right? So, well, it's just OSINT, right? And Joe says it doesn't make any sense because, the logical opposite of open source intelligence, OSINT, would be secret, or secret intelligence, right? But there's no such thing as secret, right? Because it's how you collected it. And so, I won't, belabor Joe's point. I would commend people, to the article. There's so but we've spoken about this sort of democratization of intelligence collection, right? Where anybody with an iPhone, it seems, can run around the battle space, and anybody with a social media with an internet connection, right? And even if you don't read Russian, great, you can monitor Russian Telegram channels, with Google Translate. I mean, we have the front row, to conflict in Ukraine or wherever, that's remarkable. But the democratization of analysis has also been really interesting to me. Up until the war in Ukraine, I didn't know what these substacks were, but now people like Phil O'Brien, Mick Ryan, uh, Sir Lawrence Friedman, these people are sort of chronicling the war in Ukraine, and they're relying on not secret intelligence. They're relying on, the Oryxes of the world, the OSINTers of the world. And then it's not just saying, there's this many troops or this battle damage or this number of tanks, were captured or whatever. They're actually giving analysis, right? Really proper expert analysis. David Axe is another one. I think he writes for Forbes. Um, they give the so what, and so the OSINTers aren't just counting things, they're not just saying, oh look, here's a picture of a Russian tank, and they are giving the so what, and they're giving the so what in ways that challenge, sort of the proprietary, we inside the skiff, we do the intelligence, and you do information, or you do research, or you are other. And the problem with that is that these people are coming up with really excellent analysis. Michael Kaufman, on War on the Rocks. I mean, these people are not, they don't spend all day in the skiff, and yet that analysis, I would bet you, is probably very, very similar to the analysis, that a combatant commander or that a policymaker would be getting. I mean, right down to the details. So this challenges the U.S. intelligence community in several ways. Number one, it challenges the community to bring its A game, right? If you go to a policymaker, Nick, I have a secret briefing for you, sir, ma'am, on Ukraine, but you need to come to CIA headquarters or to go to the Pentagon, or you have to go to the basement of the Capitol where there's a skiff, right? And you tell them something about Ukrainian, or Russian losses that David Axe, or that, the dead Clausewitz account, right, the dead Carl account. Um, if you are telling them what they already know because they read it in the paper or they read it online, or, I don't think that's a good day for you, right? You have to bring some sort of analytical value added in ways that, you didn't really have competition before, right? Maybe you had a think tank paper, or you had an academic who had a good article. But every day, I think policymakers, decision makers, they are inundated by really high quality analysis through various Substacks, through blogs. This stuff is coming into the public domain, right? Very, very quickly. Um, and I think if you don't, as I said, if you don't bring your A game, I think a policymaker is going to be like, look, why did you drag me down to tell me this? I read this 2 days ago online. So I think it challenges, where is, sort of where's the beef? If you remember the 1980s Wendy's commercial, right? We really have to provide decision advantage. And on the collection front, right, fine, your super secret satellite, can see into Ukraine, and that's great. Apparently now, so can NASA. Was it NASA firms or fires, right? The NASA Maxar can see in there. So the government just doesn't have, the monopoly on intelligence collection anymore, and that's not a bad thing, but it's a thing that we have to adapt to.
And it sounds like, you look at it as just really forcing the intelligence community to step up its game.
I
So it's
think
a good
so.
thing. Good thing. It's also, you mentioned this a little earlier. It's also with this information out there. It also is kind of changing our notion of who a consumer is.
Mm.
I mean, it's not just the policymakers. There's the population and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, because we talk about, strategic downgrades, or sort of, intel disclosure. Um, you know, uh, there's a long history of intel disclosure in the United States that goes back to, Adlai Stevenson at the UN in 1962, telling the Soviets, "Hey, we see what you're doing here," and they actually declassify their intelligence, their imagery intelligence from the U-2 spy plane. Reagan did it a couple of times. President Obama did it a couple of times. President Bush declassified things for the public. And I'm working on this right now as a sort of area of research focus. Um, and I want to throw maybe a little cold water on what I said earlier about, I like that the government is talking to different consumer groups, including, the United States. And the problem, of course, is once something is out there, I might be speaking to the U.S. audience, but of course, the Russians and the Chinese, everyone is listening. Once it's out there, you can't control it. And and the intelligence community, I think, has every reason to be proud of itself with the Ukraine assessment, if you like. I mean, the Brits and the Americans were, running around to anyone who would listen, declassifying ever more sort of sensitive and concrete things about the planned Russian invasion. And I think maybe they kept doing it because they weren't quite getting the traction that they wanted, maybe in certain European capitals, even in Ukraine. President Zelensky didn't want a panic, and so even he was sort of downplaying some of these risks that the intelligence community saw very, very clearly. Um, does it deter Putin from invading? Well, no, but I don't think a strategic downgrade, that's asking too much, of a strategic downgrade to deter Putin. But what it did do is I think it put him on the back foot a little bit. I think it readied NATO to react. I think it might have readied the Ukrainians at some level to react. Um, I think it took away his ability to sort of operate with disinformation and spin and false flag narratives, and by kind of getting ahead of his stories. And so I think he needed to regroup a little bit. And so I'm happy about the sort of the Ukraine call, if you like, but there were two parts of that call, and only one we got right, which was the public one. The private one, which was later revealed in Senate testimony, was that the U.S. government felt that the Russians were going to invade and that the Ukrainians would fold in 3 days, and that turned out to be wrong. And so, the second bit of that, and with great credit to the Ukrainians, and of course, it's very hard to judge, motivation, will to fight. That's a hard thing to assess. Who do I recruit to tell me if the army will fight or not? And these are very hard questions. But we got that wrong. Thankfully, it was kept private. Um, but so my concern about public disclosure going forward is that because it was perceived as being successful by policymakers, and I think that it was, at a great level to be overall a successful approach, I'm concerned that they might want to go back to the well quite a lot. And the hard part is that, as we've already talked about, intelligence is not a crystal ball. Mark Lowenthal, an intelligence scholar, and a former senior CIA analyst, says that getting intelligence right is a little bit like a baseball batter getting on base. Like even the best ones are only batting 300. You strike out more than you get right. Why? Well, hitting a baseball at 95 miles an hour is hard, and calling things, because there's so many factors in the world, calling intelligence right is hard as well. And my concern is that, if you cast your mind back to the intelligence failure of 9/11, cast your mind back to the intelligence failure of Iraq, WMD, cast your mind back to when Bin Laden sort of, made a mockery of us for 10 years, hiding in, caves or wherever, and we couldn't find him. And so on one hand, it feels good, to have this sort of renaissance of American intelligence power and to be right publicly. And that, and it supported the administration's policy for trying to lean forward, helping the Ukrainians. And I think that was all to the good. But, what happens, that was a very high confidence judgment. What happens, as with politics, Washington, the dangers of politicization, the temptation, right? Well, Mr. Policymaker, here's what we think, but our confidence level here is only medium to medium high, right? Are you going to take aboard those caveats if this supports your policy? Chances are you might drop those caveats, to sort of oversell things because it supports your policy. I don't want policies on any administration. I don't want it to be led by the intelligence. Look, intelligence says Saddam has to go because he's got a because he's got WMD, or so Intel is making us overthrow Saddam. Intel says we have to do this or we have to do that. Right? I want Intel to support the policy, to inform the policy, but I don't want it to justify the policy, and I don't want the policy maker to sort of lead, with Intel. Look, this is their policy. Intel can be wrong. Intel tries its best. And so I think the hard part about getting things right with Ukraine and with the strategic downgrades is that because it was successful, people might think it's sort of a model or a template, that you can just stamp out strategic downgrades. And the fact is, I think, on just looking at the literature on intelligence failure, we're going to be wrong at some point, and I don't want us to go back to, right after, the Iraq WMD fiasco, for instance, where, hey, look, Intel told us to do something and now it's wrong, and well, it wasn't my policy, Intel made me do it. And so I want the Intel to sort of stay, play a super integral and a really important part, but I want it to do it as it's traditionally been done, informing policy in the background, and then the policy is what the policy is. I think finally on this, point, something, Michael Morrell always says is sometimes we give intelligence, because like we were intelligence practitioners, we love intelligence. Now we're intelligence scholars. We think the world of intelligence, and we think, intelligence is the world sometimes, and it's not, and what Michael Morrell always reminds us is that intelligence, does play an important role, but it sometimes usually doesn't play the 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 size of the role that we think it does, right? Politicians think they know things. Politicians may know things. Politicians have other constituencies or other things that they're thinking about, right? So it's not, we think Intel plays this, sort of massive role, and I think we have to sort of reconcile ourselves to the fact that, we try our best, but ultimately, the policymakers are going to do what they're going to do.
Mm. Well, hey, David, thanks for the time today. I really appreciate your insight and your knowledge and sharing your experience with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave.
That's going to wrap up this special episode of the GNSI Speaker Series. Thank you to our special guest, Dr. David Gioe, Associate Professor at the West Point Cyber Institute and the Director of Studies for the Cambridge Security Initiative and co-convener of its International Security and Intelligence Program. I'm Dave Oakley, Academic Director here at GNSI. Thanks for joining us today.